Moving into a new home should be exciting, a fresh start, a new beginning. But for some people, that new beginning turns into a nightmare, because sometimes the previous owner doesn't really leave, and sometimes someone else is already hiding inside the house. These are 3 disturbing true new home horror stories. About 4 years ago, my wife and I bought our first house together. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small 2-story place in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. The house had been built sometime in the late 1970s and still had a lot of the original wood paneling and old fixtures. But for the price we paid, we felt like we had gotten extremely lucky. The previous owners were an elderly couple who had lived there for over 30 years before moving to Florida. When we first toured the place, everything looked normal. The house smelled a little old, but not in a bad way. More like dust and old carpet. We closed on the house in early October. For the first few weeks, everything was great. My wife spent most of her time decorating while I worked on small repairs around the house. Fixing cabinet hinges, repainting a few walls, replacing some light fixtures. Normal homeowner stuff. One thing I noticed pretty quickly though was that the house made a lot of noises. At night especially. The floorboards creaked constantly, and sometimes I'd hear what sounded like faint tapping inside the walls. I assumed it was just the house settling, or maybe squirrels in the attic. The house was almost 50 years old after all. About a month after moving in, my wife started mentioning that things around the house kept getting moved. Nothing major, just little things. A kitchen drawer that she swore she closed would be open in the morning. A chair slightly pulled away from the table. A bathroom cabinet open when neither of us remembered using it. At first, I brushed it off. When you move into a new house, everything feels unfamiliar. It's easy to forget where you left things. But then something happened that made it harder to ignore. One night around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Very slow footsteps. At first, I thought my wife had gotten up to go to the bathroom, but when I rolled over, she was still asleep next to me. The footsteps were coming from downstairs. I lay there listening for a few seconds. Step, step, step. Then it stopped. I figured it must have been the house creaking again, so eventually I forced myself to relax and went back to sleep. The next morning, I told my wife about it. She looked at me and said something that made my stomach drop. She said she'd heard the same thing the night before, but she assumed it had been me walking around. After that, we started noticing more strange things. Sometimes in the morning, we'd find a cabinet open in the kitchen. Other times the pantry door would be cracked open even though we were both sure we closed it the night before. But the weirdest thing was the food. Small amounts of food kept disappearing. At first it was stuff that would be easy to overlook. A few slices of bread missing. A yogurt cup gone. Half a bag of chips suddenly empty. My wife thought I was eating late at night and just forgetting. I thought she was doing the same. Eventually we even joked that maybe we had a ghost living with us. But that joke stopped being funny pretty quickly. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 months after we moved in, I was in the basement doing laundry when I noticed something strange. Behind the furnace, there was a small wooden panel built into the wall. I hadn't really paid attention to it before, but now I noticed it was slightly open, just a few inches. At first, I assumed it was some kind of maintenance access, maybe plumbing or wiring. But when I walked over and pulled the panel open, I realized it led into a narrow crawlspace that ran underneath part of the house. And inside that crawlspace, I saw something that definitely hadn't been there when we moved in. A blanket. It was balled up in the corner. Next to it were a few empty water bottles and what looked like fast food wrappers. For a second, I just stared at it, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was that maybe the previous owners had left junk behind. But the water bottles were recent. One of them still had condensation on it. I remember feeling this strange chill run through my entire body. I slowly backed out of the crawlspace and closed the panel. Then I immediately called my wife. She came downstairs and I showed her what I had found. The moment she saw the wrappers and bottles, she went completely pale. Because the restaurant logo on the wrapper was from a fast food place only about 5 minutes from our house. And the wrapper looked fresh, like it had been eaten recently. We didn't know what to do. Part of us wondered if maybe a homeless person had broken in at some point and was hiding down there. But if that were true, why hadn't we ever heard them? We decided to call the police just to be safe. 2 officers showed up about 15 minutes later. I explained everything and showed them the crawlspace. One of them shined a flashlight inside while the other stood behind us. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then the officer leaned further inside, and suddenly he froze. He slowly backed out of the crawlspace and looked at us with this strange expression on his face. Then he said something I will never forget. He said, "You might want to step outside." My wife grabbed my arm, and we both walked out to the driveway. A few minutes later, we saw the second officer pull his weapon. He disappeared into the basement. For about 30 seconds, there was complete silence. Then we heard shouting, followed by the sound of someone running. A man suddenly came sprinting out of our front door. He looked filthy. His hair was long and tangled, and he had this wild, panicked look in his eyes. 2 seconds later, the officer tackled him right in our front yard. Apparently, the man had been living inside our crawlspace. For how long, they weren't exactly sure. But judging by the amount of trash and food wrappers they later pulled out of there, the officers believed he had probably been living under our house for at least 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Which meant something else dawned on me. Those footsteps we kept hearing at night. The food going missing. The cabinets being opened. That wasn't the house making noises. It was him, sneaking upstairs while we were asleep. And the part that still makes my skin crawl to this day is what one of the officers told us before they took the guy away. They said when they first shined the flashlight into the crawlspace, the man wasn't asleep. He was awake, just lying there in the darkness, watching the opening, like he was waiting to see who would find him. This happened about 2 years ago when my girlfriend and I moved into our first rental house together. Up until then, we had both lived in apartments our entire adult lives. So finally, having an actual house felt like a huge step forward. The place was a small single-story home in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. Nothing fancy. Just a 2-bedroom house with a small backyard and a detached garage. But compared to the cramped apartment we were leaving, it felt like a mansion. The landlord seemed nice enough too. He was an older guy named Dennis who owned several properties in the area. During the walkthrough, he explained that the previous tenant had moved out suddenly because of a job relocation. According to him, the house had been empty for about 2 months before we moved in. Everything looked normal when we toured it. Clean floors, freshly painted walls, brand new locks on the doors. Dennis even handed us 2 sets of keys and made a point of saying the locks had been changed right before we moved in. For the first couple weeks, everything went perfectly. The neighborhood was quiet. The house was comfortable. And for the first time in a long time, we actually felt settled. But about 3 weeks after moving in, something strange started happening. One evening, my girlfriend came home from work before I did. When I got back about an hour later, she asked me why I had come home earlier and then left again. I told her I hadn't. She looked confused and said she was almost certain she heard the front door open around 3:30 p.m. At the time, I had still been at work. We figured maybe she had just heard the neighbor's door or something outside and mistaken it for ours. It didn't seem like a big deal. But then it happened again, a few days later. This time I was home alone in the evening while she was out with friends. I was sitting in the living room watching TV when I heard the doorknob at the front door jiggle. Not loudly, just a quick rattle. I muted the TV and looked toward the hallway. For a second, I thought maybe my girlfriend had come home early. But when I walked over and opened the door, no one was there. I stepped outside and looked around the yard. The street was completely empty. I locked the door and went back inside. Later that night, when my girlfriend got home, I told her about it, and we both kind of laughed it off. Maybe a kid in the neighborhood had walked up to the wrong house. It didn't happen again for about a week. Then one night something happened that completely changed the way we felt about that house. It was around 11:30 p.m., and we had just gone to bed. The lights were off, and we were both half asleep when we heard it. The sound of the front door opening. Not the knob this time. The actual door. I sat up immediately. My girlfriend whispered, "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, we heard something else. Footsteps. Very slow footsteps moving across the living room floor. Every instinct in my body told me someone was inside our house. I quietly got out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the closet. My girlfriend stayed behind me as we slowly walked down the hallway toward the living room. The house was completely dark, but I could hear movement. Something shifting near the kitchen. I flipped on the hallway light. The living room was empty. The front door was closed. Everything looked exactly the way we left it. We searched the entire house. Closets, bathroom, spare bedroom. Nothing. No one was there. But something didn't add up, because when I checked the front door, it was unlocked. I knew for a fact I had locked it earlier. For the next few days, we were both on edge. We double-checked the locks every night. We started leaving lights on in different rooms. Nothing else happened for about 2 weeks. Then one afternoon, my girlfriend called me while I was at work. Her voice sounded shaky. She asked me if I had come home during lunch. I told her no. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She told me she had just gotten home and found the kitchen sink full of dirty dishes. Dishes that definitely hadn't been there that morning. 2 plates, a fork, a knife, and an empty soda can sitting on the counter. The weirdest part was that the soda brand wasn't one we even bought. I left work immediately and drove home. We checked every room again. Nothing. But this time I noticed something strange near the front door. On the small table by the entryway, next to our keys, was another key. It looked identical to ours. Same shape, same color. But neither of us recognized it. That night, we called the landlord and asked if anyone else had a key to the house. Dennis sounded confused. He said the only keys that existed should have been the 2 sets he gave us. No maintenance people had been there. No one else should have had access. The next morning, we decided to install a small security camera facing the front door. And that's when we finally got our answer. At around 2:14 a.m., the camera recorded the front door unlocking, not being forced. Unlocked. The door slowly opened, and a man stepped inside like he belonged there. He walked straight into the kitchen, opened the fridge, grabbed a soda. Then he sat at the table and started eating something from a plastic bag he had brought with him, like it was the most normal thing in the world. About 10 minutes later, he got up, walked back to the door, locked it behind him, and left. We called the police immediately after watching the footage. They later identified the man as the previous tenant. Apparently, he had secretly made a spare copy of the house key before moving out. Instead of returning it, he kept it. And for weeks after we moved in, he had been coming back late at night. Sometimes just to sit in the house. Sometimes to eat. Just letting himself in like it still belonged to him. The police eventually arrested him a few days later. But what still bothers me is something the officer told us after watching the footage. The night we heard the footsteps in the living room, that wasn't the first time he had been inside. According to the timestamps on the camera, he had already entered the house twice before that, which means there's a very real chance that while we were asleep those nights, he was already inside the house with us, walking around in the dark, and we never even knew it. This happened in the summer of 2021 when my older brother and I bought a house together in rural Pennsylvania. The housing market had gone crazy that year, and anything remotely affordable was getting bought up almost immediately. So when we found this place listed way below the average price in the area, we jumped on it before someone else could. The house sat at the end of a narrow gravel road surrounded by woods. It was an older farmhouse built sometime in the 1940s, but structurally it seemed solid. The previous owner had passed away the year before, and the property had been sitting empty since then while the family sorted out the estate. During the walkthrough, the realtor mentioned that because the house had been vacant for nearly a year, we might hear some strange noises for a while. Old houses settle, she said, especially when they haven't had people living in them. At the time, that explanation made sense. My brother took the upstairs bedroom, and I took the one on the first floor near the back of the house. The place needed some cosmetic work, but overall it was livable. For the first few weeks, things were pretty normal. The only strange thing I noticed early on was the smell. Every now and then, usually late at night, there was this faint musty odor in the hallway. It smelled like damp wood or mold. But whenever I tried to track down where it was coming from, it would disappear. My brother said he never noticed it. About a month after we moved in, I started hearing noises in the walls. At first, I assumed it was mice. Old farmhouse, rural area, it seemed likely. The sounds were faint scratching and sometimes a dull thumping noise that came from somewhere behind the hallway wall near the staircase. I told my brother about it, and he said he'd set up traps if it got worse. But the noises never sounded like normal animal movement. Sometimes the scratching would stop suddenly, followed by what sounded like something sliding slowly across wood. The first time it really scared me was one night around 1 a.m. I was in the living room playing video games when I heard a loud bang from the hallway. It sounded like something heavy had hit the wall. I paused the game and walked out to check. The hallway was empty, but the smell was back. Stronger this time. That same damp, musty odor. I checked the walls, thinking maybe something had fallen behind them or maybe a pipe had burst. Everything looked normal, so again I brushed it off. A week later, my brother was cleaning out the basement when he found something strange. There was a rolled-up set of old blueprints tucked behind a water heater. He brought them upstairs and spread them out on the kitchen table. They were original floor plans for the house from the 1940s. Mostly they matched the layout of the house exactly, but there was one part that didn't make sense. On the blueprint, the hallway wall near the staircase was supposed to have a small storage room behind it, about 6 feet wide. But in the actual house, there was no door there, just a solid wall. At first, we assumed the previous owners had sealed it up during a renovation. But curiosity got the better of us. That night, we measured the hallway wall. Then we measured the rooms around it. The math didn't add up. There was definitely empty space behind that wall. About 2 days later, my brother decided he wanted to see what was back there. He grabbed a stud finder and ran it across the hallway wall. Sure enough, the framing suggested there had once been a doorway exactly where the blueprint showed it, but someone had covered it up with drywall. That alone was strange. But the thing that really bothered us was this. When my brother knocked on the wall, the sound was hollow, like there was a decent-sized space behind it. And something else. When he knocked, we both heard something move inside. A faint shuffling sound, almost like something sliding across the floor. We both froze. Then it stopped. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Finally, my brother laughed nervously and said it was probably just a rat or something trapped in there. But even he didn't sound convinced. The next day, he decided to cut a small hole in the drywall just to see inside. I remember standing there while he used a small saw to carve out a square opening between the studs. As the drywall piece fell away, a rush of stale air came out of the wall. The smell hit us immediately. That same damp odor I had been noticing for weeks. My brother shined a flashlight through the hole. At first, all we saw was darkness. Then the beam landed on the floor inside the hidden room, and we both saw something that made my stomach twist. There were blankets on the ground. Not old, dusty ones. Recent ones. Next to them were empty food containers, plastic bottles, and what looked like a small battery-powered lantern. My brother slowly widened the hole in the wall. Once it was big enough to crawl through, he climbed inside with a flashlight. The room was small, barely big enough to stand in, but it looked like someone had been living there. There were piles of trash, food wrappers, and in one corner there was a small mattress. As my brother scanned the room with the flashlight, he suddenly stopped moving. Then he said something quietly that I'll never forget. "Someone's been watching us." I asked him what he meant. He pointed the flashlight toward the opposite wall. There were 3 small holes drilled through the wood paneling, perfectly lined up. From the inside of the hidden room, they looked directly into the living room. One hole aimed at the couch, one aimed at the kitchen table, and one pointed directly down the hallway toward my bedroom door. The police came later that night after we called them. They searched the property, but didn't find anyone inside the house. However, when they checked the woods behind the property, they discovered a small campsite about 50 yards away. Whoever had been living in that hidden room had probably fled when my brother started cutting into the wall. The officers believed the person had been secretly entering the house through the basement window at night, then climbing inside the hidden room before we even realized they were there. What still unsettles me the most is something the officer said while looking at those holes in the wall. He told us they were drilled from inside the hidden room, carefully, deliberately, which means someone spent time in that space, watching us, studying our routines, learning when we slept. And the scariest part is we have absolutely no idea how long they had been there before we found that room.